Do you know what separates a failed business exit from a highly profitable one? Do you want to maximize the value of your business? The Business Exit Stories podcast is the solution. Through a collection of stories told by the business intermediaries who facilitate those transactions, you'll receive the key takeaways from successful and, yes, some not so successful business exits. Now is the time to begin to position your business for an exit by implementing key strategies designed to maximize your enterprise value and help you achieve an exceptionally profitable exit.
Today we have with us Roman Basi, a CPA attorney who specializes in working with privately held businesses on deal structure and tax planning. Roman shares with us several transactions that have unique aspects to them that highlight some of the issues that any entrepreneur needs to be aware of as they think about getting their business ready for an exit. The first transaction that Roman shares with us demonstrates why working capital requirements can often be strategically used by buyers because they are specifically designed to effectively reduce the sales price of a business. Unaware entrepreneurs that are selling their business can be surprised when they end up with a lot less than they anticipated because they allowed the working capital to be manipulated either by how working capital was defined or the amount that was going to be required to stay in the business when the business is sold. This is Marvin L. Storm with the Business Exit Stories podcast. Today we have Roman Basi with us. Roman, would you take a few minutes and talk a little bit about your company and a little bit about where you're located and what your specialty is here?
Well, Marvin, as some of you may know, my name is Roman Basi. I am an attorney, a CPA, a real estate broker, as well as a title insurance agent. My firm name is called the Center for Financial, Legal, and Tax Planning. The firm is made up of attorneys and CPAs, and our specialty is mergers and acquisitions of privately held companies all across the United States. And it's funny when we say privately held companies, we consider them small privately held companies. And a small company in the United States is one that has 50 million or less in assets, according to the definition by the IRS. So that is typically what our company does and who we represent. We specialize in the areas of valuation, tax minimization, tax planning, business succession, mergers and acquisitions. Again, with a little bit of my real estate background, we do some real estate and estate planning as well. Our corporate office is located in Illinois. And you'll see in my bio, if anyone takes a look at our website, which is taxplanning.com, or my bio, that I'm licensed as an attorney in Illinois, Arizona, Florida, and Missouri. However, we do work with merger and acquisition across the country in all 50 states because of the federal nature and the federal tax nature of buying and selling businesses. But we do also have an office in Florida, and I split my time personally between our Illinois office and our Florida office. But today we're taping here from Illinois, and that's where the majority of our corporate staff is as well. I've been practicing now alongside my father for 24 years. My father started our company back in the late 1980s, early 1990s. And to this day, that is what we do, as what we'll discuss today.
Well, this should be an interesting discussion. We talk a lot here on the podcast, Business Exit Stories, about, the different dynamics that go into, exiting a business and some of the transactional advisors that are involved, and we have had advisors on the tax side occasionally, and this will be a really interesting discussion as we kind of get down and lift up the hood on some of these transactions, because taxes now and in the past and certainly in the future are going to have a huge impact on what a founder entrepreneur is actually going to put in his pocket when he walks away from the closing table after exiting his business. So why don't we just get and jump in here today a little bit and talk about some of those specific transactions that you've been involved in that I think our audience that are listening in today might find kind of interesting, because it may impact how they view their positioning their business for sale. So why don't you talk a little bit about a transaction that has its challenges. I think as I've chatted with you in the past here, that most of your business transactions make it to closing, But talk about one that had its challenges getting closed.
Sure. And as we said, yes, most of our transactions make it to closing. I think about 99.9% of them do. It's very, very rare when they don't. One of the more recent transactions that had some difficulty, and particularly these transactions were in the insurance brokerage industry. And there's sort of a couple of them that are lumped together, but one of them importantly stuck out to me. The difficulty became in very early stages of the transaction. The client had signed a contract to sell their business, and there was a purchase price on the contract, as there typically is, although sometimes there's not. And there was a lot of other fine print in the initial offer to sell the business. And those initial offers are usually called letters of intent or indications of interest. Or yes, they can just be written on a napkin sometimes. But overall, it's called a letter of intent. And it's just an intention of how they want to sell their business. Well, very early on, they realized that what they had signed initially was not necessarily what they had initially thought they were signing as far as the purchase price of their business. There was a paragraph in the original document that talked about their working capital and the working capital requirement that they were supposed to leave on the table at closing. And this is becoming more commonplace in these initial.
I find that interesting when you say it's becoming more common. Traditionally, a letter of intent, a lot of times don't even reference, working capital requirements. Once you put that in that working capital requirement, is that something that is obligated by the letter of intent to be included in the final documents?
For the most part, that answer is yes. And you're right, we did not see working capital requirements in letters of intent as recently as 5 years ago. And back 10 years ago and 15 years ago, they were non-existent. And now we are starting to see in almost every transaction, working capital language in the letters of intent, working capital requirements, or how they're going to define it. The definition of general working capital is current assets minus current liabilities is your working capital. And what is that? And what is that average working capital that you operate your business with? And we are seeing more and more, almost in all of them now, as we sit here in 2021, we're seeing that the buyer's offers are coming in with working capital language in the letter of intent. We are now also seeing letters of intent that point out which paragraphs are binding and which paragraphs are not binding. And of course, those used to be just the confidentiality of it used to be binding, and maybe a legal clause in there used to be binding on venue. But now they're using more and more of that. And it's not become a question of whether or not that specific provision is binding or not. Our clients have felt like, Roman, I agreed to it. I didn't know what I was agreeing to. I don't want to not agree to that provision now just because it's non-binding really in the document. That's kind of been their reaction. They're like, uh-oh, what do I do now? I didn't know that's what I was signing. I didn't understand that paragraph. I thought I was selling my business for a couple $1 million, and all of a sudden I have a six-figure working capital deficiency because of what I agreed to in the letter of intent. And that's what happened.
Let me just clarify for our audience here that, the working capital requirement actually reduces what you take and put in your pocket. As you indicated, you may have a $2 million purchase price, but a $600,000 working capital requirement doesn't mean you're going to walk away with $2 million, does it?
It doesn't. Most of these working capitals definitions will just be a target of what you, the owner, should leave at the table on closing. What working capital do you normally operate with? And that's what we want you to leave at the table at closing. And if you normally have a $600,000 working capital, and all of a sudden on the closing day, it's dropped to $400,000, now your $2 million purchase price just became $1.8 million. You've just lost that deficiency at the closing table. And this is what has been happening in a couple of transactions that we've seen recently because of the language that was included early on in the letter of intent. specifically, one of them said, this particular transaction said, we want your working capital that you have as of this particular date, this particular month. And after the client signed the letter of intent, they realized that that was a very high month for their working capital. Their assets were at a high point compared to their liabilities, and they were in a very good working capital position. And when they looked at what day they were going to have at closing, a couple of months down the road, they realized that that differential was going to be significant. It was going to be in the six-figure range. They were going to be $100,000 or more below that target working capital that the buyer set. It was really the first time in my career. This happened within the last couple of months here. And it was really the first time in my career that I had ever seen a buyer put a specific date on the working capital target and have such a large impact on the closing amount they were going to receive from the purchase price.
So do you think this buyer was really sophisticated and had analyzed the financial statements and watched that working capital fluctuation and picked that specific date because he knew that working capital was high at that point in time, so he targeted that date? Or was this just by chance? What would you assume happened in this situation?
In that particular case, it was a sophisticated enough buyer that they knew what they were doing. They were buying these types of companies on a regular basis, which is what happens in our markets. Our markets see these certain groups of buyers. Maybe it's an equity group, maybe it's a private buyer. They go out, they start buying up companies, and they learn more and more on each transaction. So they approached this one before advisors were involved, before there was broker and consultants involved, but before maybe the lawyer advisor was involved, like myself, that said to them, hey, this is outside of the normal language. Why did the buyer do this? Why was it agreed upon? Did you understand the ramification of that paragraph? And is it binding? Can we change it? Or how do you, the client, now feel about changing that? Because it has a significant impact on your closing proceeds. And that's
so really the takeaway from this for our audience here as they are thinking about selling their business. The couple of things that I'm getting from your discussion here is that in today's world, there are more and more sophisticated buyers out there that acquire companies on a routine basis. They know how impactful working capital can be, and they actually use that to their benefit. And if a buyer or his advisors aren't really paying attention and have their eye on the ball, they can lose quite a bit of money at the closing table. As you say, in this specific situation, they picked a specific date where the working capital was high, and they required that amount of working capital, even though that was probably higher than what was normally there. And it had a six-figure impact on what the founder or the entrepreneur is going to walk away from the table with. And that is a big deal. So I guess the takeaway here is that being aware of the working capital requirements and what those definitions of working capital are and what kind of the norm of the industry is, sellers have to be aware of that today, because certainly what you're telling me and our audience here is that buyers certainly are.
Absolutely. That's exactly it in a nutshell. There are more buyers out there. There are sophisticated buyers out there. Companies have money right now, more than we've ever seen. The market's the busiest we've ever seen it. They're becoming more educated day by day. And when they know they can make an offer like that now, and they can put that provision into the offer, and maybe it will be negotiated, and maybe it will not be negotiated. They're giving themselves that advantage, and they know that advantage that they're taking. It's becoming more normal than what we've seen in the past. And you ask about these highlight issues in mergers and acquisitions these days. It's the first one that comes up. It's the first one that I teach some of our younger attorneys about when they're looking at a letter of intent. It's not just about the purchase price. Now it's about what adjustments are in that letter of intent that are going to impact that purchase price before we get to the closing date.
Well, that's interesting. I appreciate you pointing that out. And especially, I know from experience and talking to entrepreneurs and advisors, is that is one of the things that traditionally isn't really focused on. People understand what working capital is, but not really how the impactful that working capital requirement can be with the money that you actually walk away from the table. So that is a key insight here that anyone listening to this podcast that has a business who's going to be selling, just catalog that away into your memory here as you position your company for sale, and make sure that you understand in a letter of intent and especially in the final negotiations how working capital is going to be impacted. And I appreciate you bringing that up, Roman.
Thanks for listening to the Business Exit Stories podcast. For more information or to reach out to today's guest, visit www.businessexitstories.com for more details. Please subscribe, rate, review, and share this podcast from your favorite podcasting platforms. And remember, maximizing business value at the time of exit doesn't happen magically. It takes planning.